Welcome to the first webinar, Agroecology-TRANSECT webinar of 2025.
Thank you very much, Silag, and good morning, everyone. So I am Olivier Huguenin. I'm an agronomist, grassland scientist working at Agroscope in Switzerland. And I'm working, of course, in the project Agroecology-TRANSECT. This is an Horizon project that began in September 2022 with the title Transdisciplinary Approach for Systemic, Economic, Ecological and Climate Change Transition. And it's answering the call about laying the ground for agroecology as the future of farming by learning, engaging and inspiring actions. Okay. And I will give a short introduction to the presentation of Blaix that will follow about the meta-analysis that we perform on the effect of agroecology on biodiversity and climate change mitigation. So the overall objective of Agroecology-TRANSECT is to contribute to unfolding the full potential of agroecology for European agriculture, and this by quantifying its potential for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. And this will be the topic of today, and also as well as for the climate change adaptation and for farm socioeconomic resilience. And there is also a very important part of this project are the work with 11 innovation hubs. And so we would like to mobilize and contribute to the knowledge of these 11 innovation hubs and engage that are engaged in agroecological transformation. And we like with this project to generate actionable knowledge for the practice. And it's a project where there are partners from 12 countries. We have 11 innovation hubs and a total of 19 partners in this project across Europe. And so it's really a large project that's covering well all of Europe. Then the work you are going to hear about today it has been performed within the work package 2 of this project, which is about an improved understanding and conceptualization of agroecology in the European context. And the objective of this work package is to work on the definition, to study the definition of agroecology and their linkage to biodiversity, climate change, and livelihood resilience. You might have seen that we really tried to follow these three dimension across all the project, which are the biodiversity, climate change, and resilience. Then in this work package, we are studying the social movement supporting agroecology across Europe and also their narratives, and as well as the impact of the implementation of agroecological practice on biodiversity, climate change, and resilience. And finally, there is also some work done about the impact of the Common Agricultural Policy on agroecological practices as well as on the uptake of such practices. Yeah, because we are talking about definition narrative. There is a lot of things around agroecology. This is just an example. We have, for instance, the 13 principle of the high level panel of experts. We have the 10 elements of the FAO. We have 11 pillars from the Yeleni forum, for instance. There is a lot of discussion about agroecology, and part of the project is to try to summarize and to concretize these discussions. And for today, so we are really going to look at the impact. I mean, what do we know from the literature about the impact of the implementation of agroecological practices on biodiversity, climate change, and resilience? That's the whole thing for today. There are the two dimension biodiversity and climate change mitigation that will be presented from this literature review and meta-analysis that has been performed in the project. And the person who is going to present these results from the project is Cian Blaix. So Cian has been working for the last 2 years in the Agroecology-TRANSECT project at INRAE in France and Agroscope in Switzerland. He holds a master in earth and environmental science, and he has performed a PhD in agrobiodiversity, this in Italy, about the role of field margin in providing resource to seafrieds in an organic farm. And before joining the project, he has been working as a postdoc about the conservation of grassland in France. So as you see, he has already a lot of expertise about agrobiodiversity. And as mentioned by Silag, I would like now to ask you to turn off your mics during the presentation of Cian. We will have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to take over your questions, and or you can also write them in the chat. I will be following the chat during the presentation of Cian and also try to group similar questions so that we can handle them at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your understanding. Okay, and now is that okay? Good. So now would come Cian for his presentation.
Yeah. Okay, so can you all see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Thank you, Olivier, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to talk about this topic, which I've been working on for the past 2 years as part of the Agroecology-TRANSECT project. So I will talk about this meta-analysis that we've been working on the effects of agroecology on biodiversity and climate change mitigation, according to the according to the scientific literature. And just to start by briefly also mentioning that this work I didn't carry it out all on my own. I also had the contribution of well, the people that you see listed here: Bertrand Dumont, Juliette Blour, Géraldine Florence, Frédéric Joly, Cecilia Zagaria, and Olivier, of course. And I will start by giving you a brief introduction on the topic. So as you all probably know, we're facing an environmental crisis at the moment, which is linked to both, well, partly linked to both biodiversity loss and climate change. And these two phenomena are not independent of each other. They're interlinked, as biodiversity loss can contribute to climate change, and climate change can affect biodiversity loss, while biodiversity itself can also offer resilience to climate change. So it makes sense, since current agricultural practices are a key contributor to these issues, it makes sense to look at if there are alternative systems or ways of producing food that can mitigate both of these problems. And agroecology seems to be a good venue for this, since it is built on the principles that optimize ecological processes, and also can offer multiple ecosystem services. And these services could contribute to mitigating both biodiversity loss and climate change. So there have been attempts, well, there are studies conducted on the effects of interventions or practices or systems that are associated with agroecology and their effects on climate change mitigation and biodiversity, and you find them here on the screen. So, well, just a very small sample of a larger literature. And they tend to show a positive effect of these practices that are associated with agroecology. However, we're lacking a synthesis that uses agroecology as a framework. So none of these really use the term agroecology or employ any framework associated with that we use in the agroecology for their meta-analysis or reviews. So with this in mind, our aims were to gather data from the scientific literature on the effects of agroecological interventions on biodiversity and climate change mitigation variables in Europe. In Europe, because this is the scope of the project. And also, as you see later on, we had a lot of results from the literature search, so it helped us not being overwhelmed by the amount of studies in the database. And then we conducted a meta-analysis to assess the size of these effects while also considering the following potential influences. So functional groups, what I mean by this is groups of organisms based on the functions that they have in an agroecosystem. For example, we have groups of predators or pollinators. We also looked at the effects of agricultural land use types. So this is just a way of differentiating between our orchards from our cropping systems, or our perennial systems from our herbaceous horticulture system, and larger scale cropping systems and grasslands. And we also looked at the effect of agroecological transition types. So for this last factor, I will go more into details about this later on. So the first issue that we encountered with this work when we were thinking of how we gather data from the scientific literature on this topic was the notion itself of agroecology. So what is agroecology? What do we mean by the effect of agroecology? What are agroecological practices or systems? So this highlighted a need to establish a framework for us to work within. So the first one that we used, well, the first one that came to mind were the principles of agroecology as defined by the high-level panel of experts on the, food security. And here they came up with 11 principles that help define what is agroecology. So these principles operate at multiple scales. So you have the principles associated with the agroecosystem scale, so farm level in a way. And then you have the food system scale principles. So related to more social aspects of agroecology. What we're going to be focusing on here today, and well, for this work in general, are those that operate at the agroecosystem scale, as these will be the ones that we're going to find really in the literature that show the effects of agroecology on biodiversity and climate change mitigation. And what you can see here is that biodiversity itself is actually one of the principles amongst the 11. However, there are no dedicated principles to climate change, so it's not explicitly mentioned in any of the principles. But we can identify a few that could be relevant to climate change mitigation, such as recycling, input reduction, and soil health. However, looking at this, we came to the realization at the start that it might be a bit harder to find studies with CC mitigation, climate change mitigation data, because it's not explicitly identified as a principle in agroecology. So we have our way of identifying potential practices or systems that could be rated to agroecology. However, a lot of practices could adhere to these principles and yet maybe fall short of what we would consider as an agroecological practice or system. So we are in need of another, we were in need of another framework to help us really identify the most relevant systems or practices to our topic. And first of all, I'd just like to, you heard me mention agroecological intervention already, and it's a term that I'm going to use quite often probably this morning. And this is just a way for us to englobe both notion of systems or practices relating to agroecology. And to identify these agroecological intervention that we're going to use, that we did use in our work, we made use of Griezmann's food system change levels, so which are based on the efficiency input substitution redesign model. So you have a visual representation of this food system change, these food system change levels. So here they range from 0 to 5, with 0 being no agroecological integration. Level 1, we increase efficiency of industrial inputs. At level 2, these industrial inputs are substituted with alternative practices or inputs. And at level 3, there's a redesign of the whole agroecosystem. I'm not going to mention the food system levels, so level 4 and 5, because they're beyond the scope of our work. But so the idea here with these levels is to identify, to place the cursor of where we want to be when we select our interventions for the meta-analysis. And what we decided was to include level 3 interventions, so those that involve a redesign of the whole agroecosystem, and also level 2 interventions. However, with the caveat that these interventions must, well, the studies in which the interventions are analyzed must have taken or used a systems approach, which is to say that we didn't accept any studies that just compared one practice at the input substitution level, but studies with multiple practice or well-defined systems that are compared passed our criteria. So now we have our agroecological interventions, and we can also use these levels to classify them along a gradient of agroecological transitions. Sorry. So we have our comparator, which are the conventional interventions, and these are also regroup the efficiency level interventions because they're not always easy to distinguish one from the other. And these are compared with input substitution and redesign interventions, but also we have in certain cases the comparator is an input substitution intervention that's compared with a redesign intervention, or with another intervention still at this input substitution level, but more agroecological. So these are our 4 main agroecological transition types. So just to give you a few examples of the interventions that we identified. On the left, you have the input substitution interventions. So organic farming is a typical one. And then you also have no-till, no fertilization. And this Griezmann level framework had its limitations in terms that it wasn't very easy to implement for grassland systems. So we had to be a bit subjective here and decide, in this case, for example, to put extensive grazing and extensive mowing at this level, also delayed mowing. And at the redesign level, we put unmowed refuges and mixed grazing, for example. Okay, I will also go through these more examples of interventions later on. On to the meta-analysis strategy. So to explain the strategy that we used, I will use the biodiversity meta-analysis as an example. So the first step was to define the keywords for the search query. And you have some examples of keywords here that are associated with biodiversity. Then we had, of course, other keywords that were associated with the agroecological interventions. Then combining those keywords to form a search query, we were able to perform our literature search on both. So we conducted 2 literature searches on one on Scopus and one on Web of Science. And once we had our results, so as you see, we found many studies, 13,262. And due to the high number of studies, I decided to use a online tool, which is called AS Review, that makes use of artificial intelligence to help us screen abstracts. How does it screen studies? Sorry. How does it do this? Well, the artificial intelligence basically classifies the most relevant study to the least relevant, based on information given to it, prior information on if in a small sample of studies, if you tell it which ones are relevant and which ones are not relevant. So what this does is it means that you're screening the most relevant studies first. And as you screen the studies, the AS review continues to adapt its classification so that it takes into account all your choices to try to offer you every time the most relevant study. And what it means is that you don't have to actually screen all the studies. At a certain point, you'll find that you don't have any more relevant studies and you can stop the screening process. So this resulted into, well, in us obtaining 1,261 studies for full text screening. And out of these, 133 primary studies were obtained. What I forgot to mention also is that one of the criteria for the selection is that we're only interested in primary studies, but also meta-analysis. However, modeling studies and reviews we discarded. And these meta-analysis we use to, first of all, have a general idea of what had been done in the field already. And secondly, to use as a kind of a feedback mechanism to find missing studies. So we looked at the meta-analysis and we tried to spot any studies that were missing from our corpus. And if we found a study that was missing, we looked at the reason why it was missing. And if it was due to a missing keyword, then we debated whether this keyword should be added to the search query. And if we deemed it relevant to add it to the search query, we did so, and we rerun the literature search to find additional articles. So once all this process is done, well, we were able to then extract the data and start analysis. So as we saw, we had 133 studies for biodiversity. For climate change mitigation, we had less studies, but still a decent number, so 72 studies. And here you can see also the geographical spread of the studies. So as mentioned previously, we focused on Europe, and most of the studies originated from Central and Mediterranean regions in Europe. And however, we didn't find many studies in the Eastern Europe, which was a bit disappointing. However, it seems to be a bit of a trend that I observed also looking at other meta-analysis and also other work done in the project, is that it's harder to find peer-reviewed studies on this topic in Eastern Europe. So on to the results. Just a few pointers on how to interpret these graphs. So the symbols represent mean effect sizes for each variable. And associated with the symbols, you have error bars. And these error bars represent 95% confidence intervals. And if these error bars do not overlap with the 0 line that you see here, we considered the effects to be statistically significant. And here you also see some numbers. So these indicate the effect sizes, and in parentheses, you have the number of studies. And in the case of the graph on the climate change mitigation, you see that we have letters associated with the mean effect sizes. And these are results of post-hoc analysis looking at the difference between means. So if you have two different letters, as you see here, then this means that the two effect sizes are significantly different. And so what you see here and is that we have a positive overall effect of agroecological interventions on both biodiversity and on climate change mitigation. So for biodiversity as well, this positive effect is significant for all our 5 functional groups that we identified. So the last two here are micro decomposers and macro decomposers. And for climate change mitigation, our variables are carbon storage, and here the top 3 are the mitigation of the emissions of nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and methane. So if you see a positive value, it means that there's a positive effect of agroecological interventions on the mitigation of these emissions. So it's a good thing. And we see for climate change mitigation that the effect was significantly positive for both carbon storage and nitrous oxide emissions, the mitigation of nitrous oxide emissions. However, we weren't able to detect a significant effect on the other two greenhouse gases. This might be due for methane emissions, at least in part to the fact that we had very few effect sizes and studies. For carbon dioxide, it's something that we hadn't anticipated. And we think that this result is linked to the one observed on carbon storage and also on the decomposers. Why is this? Well, we think it's the result of a soil respiration process because most of the data that were obtained on CO2 emissions were the results of soil samples on CO2 emissions. So they were really measuring soil respiration. And here I just have to point out, well, highlight the fact that what we have is carbon storage and it's not carbon sequestration. We didn't find many studies that looked at carbon sequestration, which is a bit of a pity. So the way to interpret this result is not that carbon is absorbed, more carbon is absorbed by agroecological interventions, well, due to agroecological interventions by the soil, but that the soil in agroecological interventions is storing more carbon than the comparator. So there's a more greater potential to stock this carbon and not have it released in the atmosphere. So just to explain this relationship between soil organic carbon and CO2 and the decomposers, well, with greater, in the agroecological interventions, we have greater soil organic carbon, so a greater labile C compartment, which so provides resources to decomposers, which leads to an increase in soil respiration and CO2 emissions. And moving on. So looking at the effect of agricultural land use types, this had an effect only for the biodiversity results. We see that perennial systems had a more significant effect than horticulture systems, and that agroecological interventions in horticulture systems were not significant. And this, we had a few hypotheses linked to this. One being that the horticulture systems, when they were sampled, they used smaller plot size, so which resulted in lower numbers of species, so harder to find a large delta between interventions than the perennial system, which were large scale. And for climate change mitigation, yes, we only found a positive effect for arable systems. And this may be due also to the fact that we found many more effect sizes for arable systems than for the other system types. Although we did find a good few studies for perennial systems, we didn't have that high number of effect sizes. And then moving on to agroecological transition types. The good news is that we found that all transition types had a positive effect for biodiversity. So this means that it doesn't matter what level you are, as long as you move up on the agroecological transition gradient, you have a positive effect on biodiversity, at least on the size of the gradient, on the part of the gradient that we focused on. And that was not the case though for climate change mitigation, although most of the transition types had a significant effect. on the climate change mitigation. We did find a significant effect for S2S prime. However, what we can say is that as long as we moved away from a agroecological transition level, we had an increase in climate change mitigation. Although this result also has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because especially for the conventional to the redesign transition, for which we only had 10 studies that showed these types of transitions. We didn't find any differences in magnitudes of effects between different intervention types, different transition types. And I was half expecting to find a stronger effect when moving from conventional to redesign compared to conventional to input substitution due to the larger step required in this transition type. But this was not the case. So just this is the final analysis that I'm going to present. And it's a joint analysis we conducted by looking at studies that had effect sizes for both biodiversity and climate change mitigation. So the idea here was to look at if there was a trade-offs or synergies amongst those studies for both of these dimensions. And what we found was that we found a general win-win situation. So this is represented by the black dot here. And that in general, we had both positive effects on biodiversity and climate change mitigation in studies. We didn't find any lose-lose situations amongst the studies. We did find some trade-offs in some studies, especially with negative effects on climate change mitigation while obtaining positive effects for biodiversity. And this, well, at least for the studies that were on the more extreme side of the graph on the left side, and so these two studies can be explained by the fact that they focused on the CO2 emissions. So we already talked about the relationship between CO2 and macro decomposers, and this is what you're observing here. So that's it for the analysis, and I'm just going to end with giving you some examples of the intervention types that we observed in our data set. So this may be some of interest to you, but what I will say is that we can't really make much of interpretation on these results, since we're lacking on statistical power to really say if these interventions had a benefit or not on biodiversity or climate change mitigation. And I'm just going to focus on biodiversity because this is the dimension that we had the most data for. And here for grasslands, you see that the most common type of intervention that we had was extensive management of grasslands, and it didn't really seem to affect that much biodiversity. And we also had some studies that looked at grassland refuge zones in grasslands and mixed livestock. There's not much to say about this in terms of interpretation. So I'll move on to horticulture. And yes, here, well, as you saw previously, horticulture was the system for which we had less effect sizes amongst the four. So we can't really make much of an interpretation on these results. And moving on to perennial systems. So here what's interesting is that we had a strong effect for interrow vegetation. So I should have mentioned also the bars, what they represent, sorry. The larger bars represent confidence intervals, so 95% confidence intervals. And the narrower bars represent prediction levels, so 95% prediction levels. So we're not really interested in the prediction levels. It just demonstrate really the spread of the data. What we're more interested in is the confidence intervals. And we see that interrow vegetation had a strong effect on biodiversity. And this is actually something I forgot to mention. And one of the reasons that we probably found also a strong difference between perennial system and horticultural systems for biodiversity is that while in a perennial system, the addition of an interrow crop, it adds a new vegetation strata to the habitat. So this probably contributes to the greater effect on biodiversity. So it creates a new habitat within the agroecosystem that can be exploited by other organisms. While in the horticulture systems, if I go back, the intervention that will be most similar to this would be agroecological service crops, maybe. So I didn't actually explain what this is. Some of the studies refer to agroecological service crops. These tend to be cover crops or green manure. And so crops that are not used, grown for their end products, but more for their contribution to ecological processes, maybe in the agroecosystem. So these could be the addition of flower strips. Well, so we have also flower strips here, and we see that the effects, although we don't have as many effect sizes maybe as for the perennial system comparison, we see that it's not as strong. So just moving on now to the last land use type, that's arbor crops. So this is the land use type for which we had the most data. And you see that organic farming dominates this in this land use type. So despite of one of the reasons also for our decision to limit input substitution interventions to those that had a well-described a systems approach was that we found many studies that just compared fields with organic certification with fields that didn't have them. So these were excluded, and despite this, we still found many examples of comparisons of between organic and conventional systems. So it's not a bad thing per se. It's still interesting to observe this strong effect of organic farming on biodiversity. The other one that's had many studies associated with was intercropping, although the effect is not really significant. Okay, so I will end by just mentioning some gaps in the literature, and then I will with the final conclusion. And so the first one mentioned here is the lack of studies identifying and defining a system as agroecological when studying effects of biodiversity and climate change mitigation. And what I mean by this is that in our data set, most of the studies that we found didn't actually use the term agroecology or agroecological and so on. And those that did not really define properly why their interventions that they considered were agroecological. So two main things that I take away from this is that one, there is a gap in the literature in terms of there's a potential to publish studies that use an agroecology as a framework to look at the effects on biodiversity and climate change mitigation. And secondly, although if you're going to do this, I think it'd be wise to mention why the intervention that you're focusing on is agroecological. So this could be done, for example, as we did it by using Cleese levels as a framework or as a point of comparison. Secondly, more peer-reviewed studies conducted in Eastern Europe are needed. So we were pretty confident that our search query was pretty robust in terms of finding all the, well, not all, but there's always going to be some studies that will be missing, but many of the studies are published on this topic. And partly due to the use of our feedback mechanism using a meta-analysis, and partly because we also asked the other members of the project, with many members also of the project are based in Eastern Europe, on if there were any studies missing from the list of studies that we found. So I think the issue really is that there aren't many peer-reviewed studies published in Eastern Europe on the effects of agroecology on biodiversity or climate change mitigation. Next point is more studies are needed on the effects of agroecology on biodiversity in horticulture systems. And I don't really have much to say on this. I expected to find more, but we didn't. And there's a lack of empirical studies also on the effects of climate change mitigation on horticulture and grassland systems. So for grassland systems, I think the ones that we found, they did actually look at enteric greenhouse gas emissions, so methane emissions. And the emissions that they looked at were soil emissions usually. This is probably because it's easier to analyze these effects in using modeling approaches. And so yeah, it would be nice to have found more empirical studies with data on this topic. And then finally, more empirical studies presenting a full carbon or even the greenhouse gas balance are needed. So I already mentioned the decoupling between soil CO2 emissions and carbon storage. So it would be good to have we did find one or two studies, but not enough to conduct a meta-analysis. It would be nice to have found more that detail this full carbon balance to really assess the effects of agroecological intervention on CO2. And more data needed on the effects of agroecology on nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions also. So we're missing, yes, data on these two emission types. And actually, one more thing that I noticed it doesn't feature here, but I noticed there are a few people in the crowd that are not from Europe. And so, of course, one gap in the literature is that I don't think that any other study has been conducted like this outside of Europe. So the effects of agroecology on biodiversity and climate change mitigation in the countries outside of Europe. So that's another gap, I suppose, in the literature. I'll finish off now with some conclusions. So what we found was that studies conducted in Europe show a general positive effect of agroecological interventions on biodiversity and on climate change mitigation. And the effect for biodiversity was significant for all of the functional groups that we identified in our study. And we also find benefits for carbon storage and also nitrous oxides, so the mitigation of nitrous oxide emissions, but not for the mitigation of methane and carbon dioxide emissions. And what I thought was a very nice result also was that a steady increase in biodiversity and climate change mitigation variables was found along an agroecological transition gradient. Okay, so I will finish up here and leave room for questions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Cian, for your presentation. And we have two questions from the chat, two question of understanding. So I suppose it's good to start with them. And the first one is about slides number 10. That's about the agroecological intervention, the examples of agroecological intervention. And the question was, if when you write no fertilization, you mean no chemical fertilizer? Or if it's
Yes,
broader.
that's true. Yes, sorry. Yes, indeed. Yes, it's a chemical fertilization. We could have situations where the chemical fertilization is replaced by organic fertilization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's clear. Thank you. Thank you very much. And the second one, it's about and one of, I mean, the last series of result about the different type of interventions. I mean, this figure where you separated the different types of interventions, and the question was about each of the dot. What's the representativity of each of the dot? Yeah, these ones.
Oh, sorry.
If you can.
This one is
the last, yes, this one. If you can
Oh, sorry. Yes.
explain a
Okay.
little
Yeah.
bit, because you have also different size
Yes.
of the dots. So if you can explain a little bit what are the dots?
Yes. Sorry. Indeed, I should have done this. So the dots actually represent effect sizes, and with each effect sizes, there's a error associated with the estimation. So the smaller dots have a greater error, and the bigger dots have a lower error.
Okay. So the biggest dot, the more weight it has in.
Yes, exactly. The more weight it contributes to the mean effect size.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. So I
Um,
didn't see any other
maybe
question in the chat.
there's one thing I forgot to mention, and that is that the emissions that we used are units represented. Sorry, they're represented in the units per area and not per production. That's probably a small detail that's important to take into account. So for the calculation of nitrous oxide emissions, CO2 emissions, methane, and even carbon, they're represented in per area to be comparable with the biodiversity effects, and also because they were the most common types of units that were found in the literature search.
Okay, and there have been some popping out yet now just when you were answering the question. So one is it's a comment from Bertrand. Could you comment on why the integrated crop livestock did not appear among your land use type, and on how, if any, benefit of integrated crops and livestock were obvious in some of the paper?
Yes, well, integrated crop livestock, we did, yes, as mentioned by Bertrand, we did find many examples. I'll show you how many we found. Actually, will probably be in the, but yeah, mixed crop livestock here. Yeah, we had 2 studies here. Actually, there might be more because there are 2 studies that focus on the arable aspect. But yes, to answer the question, I think one reason might be because it's you need a large scale to learn a large scale study to see those effects. So it's probably more costly to look at such to conduct such studies, maybe. So it's you're really looking at the farming system scale. So compared to, for example, intercropping that you can look at, just you can run a study in the field, in one field. And maybe yes, we were hoping to find more, and we tried also. That's something that we noticed earlier on, that we were missing studies that looked at mixing system types, so integrated cropping systems. And so we tried to adapt our search query and looked at what we're missing, but we struggled to find any empirical studies on this topic. Maybe there are more modeling studies that look at this. But yes, what I don't remember exactly what kind of effects these 2, well, these 2 studies obviously show a tendency to have a positive effect, but I mean, we can't really interpret the results from only 2 studies.
Thank you. Do you wish to add something, Bertrand? Don't seems to be the case. So there was another question about biodiversity and about the effect of the different metrics you can find in the diversity
Yes.
in biodiversity studies. Did you see there an effect of the different metrics?
Yes. Actually, I will show it here. So we regrouped all the metrics into 3 types. So richness, species rich, taxa richness actually, evenness, diversity refers to Shannon diversity and Simpson diversity, and abundance. So yeah, I did show these results because we were limited on time. But what we found is that the effects are significant for all metrics except for evenness for some reason. And there are some differences also. The effect on richness seems to be a bit stronger than for the diversity and abundance metrics. So we do observe some differences, but so I don't have graphs here. But when you look at the effects of, for example, agricultural land use types on the biodiversity effects, you see the same pattern for richness, diversity, and abundance. So we don't really see much difference when looking at the effects of other factor levels.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question about if the study is already published. It's not the case. We are finishing now the manuscript. It would be submitted in 1 week or two, but published it's not yet. And there was another question about if you could give more details about the cropping system in the arable land use.
Yes.
Which crop are included, mainly wheat or the crops? Could there be a crop type effect, like high pesticide use in a crop like rapeseed, low in soybean, for instance? Or do you think there is such effect?
There probably is a cropping type effect. I don't think we have well, it's the same problem with the intervention type. We need more data to be able to really analyze this effect. Just yes. So what we find in what features in this arable category is mainly grain crops, so wheat and etc. But we also have large scale crops. It's more related to herbaceous crops, so large scale herbaceous crops. So we could even anticipate to find. Well, I don't actually have an example of. I don't have them in mind at the moment, but it doesn't necessarily have to be only grain crops. But it could be also potatoes, for example, if they're grown at a large scale.
And we also had some studies with rotation, so with many crops included.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it could be also forage crop. So temporary grasslands included in the rotation, for example.
Mhm. And there is another question about, I'm quite surprised by the lack of positive effects shown on grassland, where you too. But I think that we have to differentiate a little bit in grassland. There was also some positive effect. Um,
So is this related to biodiversity or?
yeah, it's what I say. It's not precise by the question, and I think you have to differentiate a little bit between uh, biodiversity and climate change to answer this question.
Yeah, well, for biodiversity, we found a positive effect.
Yes, it's
For
what I mean.
yeah, okay. For climate change mitigation, I don't, I don't have much to say really. It might be also an effect of statistical power again. I'll just share my screen once more. Sorry. Uh, so what we found was that we had only 11 studies for grasslands for climate change mitigation. So, but you see that the tendency is that it's positive. It's just that with such a low sample size, 38 effect size is quite low. So it doesn't allow us to detect significant effects. Yes, we are more surprised ourselves by the lack of studies that we found on well, using empirical data on the effects of agroecology on in grasslands on climate change mitigation.
Mhm.
And this might be also, again, I have a feeling that modeling studies tend to be conducted when analyzing this topic. And again, among those 11 studies, there's no study that looked at enteric methane emissions, which would be a big factor in greenhouse gas emissions in grassland, in livestock systems. For carbon storage, I expected to find more studies on carbon storage, to be honest, in grasslands.
And for that, I would like to add also that the studies does not consider a change in land use. So there is, I mean,
Yes.
it's comparison of two different grassland system, and it's not a comparison where we could pass from a grassland system to a cropping system or something like that.
And I'll just add one more thing that I forgot to mention is that we only consider studies that were published after, well, in 2014 and after. That was due to the high number of results that we found in the literature search.
Okay, so let's Another question. Uh, could you also say something about the geographical distribution of studies in the dataset? Are all climate zone and biome in Europe included, and landscape type simplified versus diversified? Because one expect a strong effect of climate zone and or biome and or landscape on how agroecology affect biodiversity.
Yes, they're all included, but as you can see, there's we found many more studies on the Mediterranean regions and Central Europe. So Mediterranean region, of obviously, it's well warmer climate, and we have Switzerland included that on many studies on biodiversity in Switzerland, and here we have also alpine regions and a contrast between this and the Mediterranean regions. What we found also is there's a trend, I suppose, on the type of systems depending on the countries. So horticultural studies looking at horticultural systems were mostly found in Spain and Italy, while grasslands studies maybe more often in Switzerland and I think it was maybe France and Germany also. France and Germany, I think there was even enough distribution between the land use type. But for example, UK and Ireland, what we mostly found was grasslands. So we did have these type of geographical trends in the data. How they affect biodiversity results, I have to say I did look at this. It could be something that we can investigate. But yeah.
And then maybe I will ask Laurence Modrego, sorry if I mispronounce your name, to jump in just to precise her question about grassland and the effect, because obviously I was a little wrong with how I presented her question.
Thank you for giving me the floor. No, I think I added it was slide 16, but now I see it was slide 18 of
Okay.
examples of AE intervention types on grasslands. And I think Cian said that there was no significant effect shown by the data. Maybe I misheard. And I'm not sure what this slide was demonstrating. Was it biodiversity, climate change mitigation, or both?
Just biodiversity, sorry. Yeah.
So is it showing that you could not demonstrate positive effect of biodiversity?
Well, it's just that we lack data to make robust interpretation of these results. Because the one with the most, except maybe for extensive management, we could probably say that there's no effect. But again, it's only from 9 studies, which is quite low number.
Okay, but maybe we have to precise. So there was an effect of agroecology on biodiversity in grassland systems, a clear effect when you consider all type of intervention.
Yes.
And there in this figure, can try to separate the different types of intervention there was in studies. And with the power we had at this level of separation of the study, then here we don't find something significant. But considering all overall, there is.
Okay, thank you. And as you mentioned, I think it was comparing the effect of agroecology intervention on grassland compared to previous non-agroecological grassland use, right? So they were it was still used for grazing.
So yeah, just actually one thing maybe I wasn't very clear on when looking at agroecological transitions is that it's a space for time approach that we used. So what we compared were 2 interventions measured at the same time. So one representing an agroecological intervention in a study, sorry, and another representing a comparator. So usually, yes, it would be maybe a grassland that used maybe fertilizer, for example, compared to one that that you had more of an extensive management.
And maybe you can give a little more information about how you identified the control or defined the control. What were the restrictions you put on the control?
Yes, it had to be considered as a good agriculture management practice. That is to say, for example, we excluded in cropping systems continuous monocropping year after year of, for example, maize. And what else? I think that was the main factor that we looked at for inclusion as a comparator.
Mm-hmm. But we were targeting a severe comparison where the control were already something we could consider as good agricultural practice and not something just an experimental treatment where that would not correspond to something what one would do in the practice. Good. Okay. Then I will try to understand that. Another question about it's in grasslands and forest grazing, the holistic livestock farmer are making a huge gain, but very little of it is being recording. Maybe I will ask the one who wrote that, Sam Osborne, to tell us a little bit more about his question. Sam? Okay. Maybe you are muted. Oh, I don't know. Anyway, it don't seems to be working. In case Sam, you just jump in case you manage to. But of course, there is. I mean, we are aware that there are some practices that are not well informed in research, but the meta-analysis was concentrated about the the results that we had that were scientifically tested. Do you like to add something, Kin?
I think maybe Sam can speak now. I think he's unmuted.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, we can't hear him. Sorry, we can't hear you, Sam. But for holistic approaches, I think there aren't many not many studies. It's difficult, I assume, to conduct studies on such approaches because it demands not just one holistic farm, but a comparator as well to compare with, and maybe some replicates. So I would say that you're looking at long-term experiments at the farming scale. There aren't that many of them, I think, in Europe. There are some. And so it's obviously something that this type of analysis that we conducted is not going to value enough. That is not to say that it should be. I have to say I think it would be better to have an explanation of the question to really answer what.
Maybe it will come. An interesting aspect also, I think it's. I mean, when you have showed the different functional groups for biodiversity, and the number of studies we found with respect to agroecology, you might have remarked that the balance between the different functional groups are maybe not what we are used to see on biodiversity studies. And I think this is really interesting. And I mean, you might comment about that, Keen. And it has to do also with what we see with the CO2, I think.
Yes, I expected to find more on pollinators. The decomposers, we actually separated into two. So if you take them all together, they're actually the most abundant, probably the most representative of of the functional groups, and maybe it's also due to maybe it's easier to conduct studies on the decompose. I'm not actually sure. Well, I mean, soil samples are you just need to do soil samples for decomposers, which takes it's maybe quicker to do than the surveys of plants. Although then you have to analyze those soil samples in lab, so maybe that's not true. I don't know. What do you think, Olivier?
I think it has also to do with what is agroecology for in many cases, and the interest there is in this topic about soil health. Soil health is also a very important pillar or element of agroecology, and I think it's this interest about soil health that we are also seeing in with this unbalance if we compare with other biodiversity studies.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems there is no more new question, but I would like to invite people to jump in if there are supplementary questions or comments about the work. I will try to see if there is someone raising the hand. Are there comments or questions about what has just been presented? Okay, it doesn't seem to be the case.
All right. Sam.
Yeah, no, Sam is there.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, that's working now.
I had
Thank
some
you.
serious Zoom tech issues there. Yeah, about grasslands, and there's a lot of holistic livestock farmers around at the moment, and it's a growing movement. Lots of information about it on Twitter and some on Blue Sky. They're making great progress. I got into it about 8 years ago and started mob grazing. It's got lots of different terms to define it, but it's basically cell grazing. You put the animals in a fenced area, in enough animals for 1 day, and then the next day you tend to move them to another area. So it's very controlled grazing. A lot of farmers go into long grass grazing, so the vegetation is allowed to grow to its maximum height, seeding, flowers, and all of that. And because you're only doing one cell each day, then the rest of the landscape is ungrazed and is free to grow or that kind of thing. It makes huge ecological gains. It's absolutely unbelievable. I took that approach into the woodlands, into forests, and do the same thing there, and we get the same kind of gains. So one example, I took some sheep into a woodland about 5 years ago and treated it as though the sheep were a herd of elephants, because elephants were one of our historic herbivores in Europe and many places around the world. And within 18 months, I got big buzzards hunting in that area of woodlands. They couldn't even get in there before. And about 2 months later, I got a Ural owl arrived, which is, I'm just on the edge of its range. And it's a great big massive owl. And they actually hunt in the same territory. The number of plants that are now growing on my farm is unbelievable, as in the different types. It's all natural vegetation. It's showing me that tree foliage is part of the food web, which is mostly ignored these days. So yeah, there's a lot going on. There really is a lot going on, but there's very little of it being recorded by science. I've tried to get ecologists down here onto my place, and a couple turned up, but they're always too busy with their other projects. So there's a lot more research and data collection is vitally needed, because before we had agriculture, herbivores were the ecosystem engineers, and they can do a lot for our ecosystem, basically, because they are the original managers. We're not very good at it. We're playing catch up. But the herbivores they've got millions of years of experience. So I would invite any scientist to kind of go and find your local holistic mob grazer and go and do some research, because I mean it's a perfect environment for research, because you're dealing with a known quantity of land, a known number of animals for a known period of time. And once the animals have gone, then all the plants that have been trampled or grazed then respond. And there's so much to record there, so much data, so many things going on in the soil, and in the soil zone just above the soil with the lower vegetation, and then in the space above that as well. This is how I got into vegetation structures. So agroecology can fix a lot of those ecological issues that we have, and the farmers have the animals. They're spread all over the world. I think it's an amazing opportunity. I'll leave it there, or I'll just ramble on for hours about this.
Thank you very much for this comment. Bertrand, you mentioned something on the chat. Do you like to give some element of answer?
No, I just wanted to highlight, following Sam's comment, that what we consider here for this meta-analysis were published results in journal that are in the Web of Science and Scopus, and we are fully aware that it only represents a small part of all the things that are being tested by practitioners in Europe or all over the world. So we are aware that our objective was really to make a meta-analysis based on published scientific papers, which does not mean that we don't consider the other initiative as relevant, but this was what we did here. And just also on extensive grazing, I would like to precise that it also depends on how we define agroecological interventions, because there are many published papers at plot level that compare different stocking rates, and we just consider that decreasing stocking rate is not enough for us to be considered as agroecological. So we excluded in the analysis papers that were at plot level, just testing different level of stocking density, but we consider at system level initiative that decrease stocking density at the farm level, or that tested for some innovations. You mentioned mob grazing, but we also tested for also having different grazing intensity and excluding part of the grazing lands during the main flowering season, for instance, when it was done at the farm level. So finally, we opted to have a very ambitious definition of what is agroecology, and maybe this is also why we did not have so many papers, but it would have been so many papers to deal with, but that would be impossible. So we try to have this ambition definition of agroecology, and focusing on the scientific literature. What Cian has shown is what comes out from these methodological choices.
Thank you, Bertrand. And we also hope, of course, with the study to show where is lacking, what is lacking also in the research up to now. So it will also be a conclusion of this meta-analysis to point out where the domain where it's still missing.
And maybe kids, you could just comment on what you are doing now, because what you have shown today is the result of an analysis of scientific papers, but we also produce a milestone in the project where we focus on the indicators used by practitioners, and you are also now working with Clélia Serami, our colleague at INRAE Toulouse, and she's interested in the indicators that are being used in public policy to track the effect of changing policy. Maybe you could add a final comment of what you are doing now?
Yes, okay. So as part of the Agroecology-TRANSECT project, we're not just interested in what is being published scientifically. We also have working groups and other tasks that focus on what the farmers look at, use as indicators, or what are indicators that can be used by farmers in the field. And that's what I think Cecilia is here. She's working on this. And we also have people looking at the policy aspects and what indicators do policymakers potentially use for, well, for example, for biodiversity. So my task then would be to have a look at the coherency between what is being used by scientists, policymakers, and farmers or managers of land, and to see if they're connected to the indicators, or if there's a disassociation between the three sets of indicators.
Thank you. And there was another, maybe a final question. It is broader, it has, but it's I think it's fitting well to the project. The question about the economic component. Would you have an idea of the economic component? What incentive do farmers need to shift to agroecology? And this is indeed not part of our work in this project, but there are different teams in the project working on exactly this aspect about the effect. I mean, the barriers and the levers for shifting to agroecology. And so the economic it's part of this different task within the project. So from the project we will know more about it, not from our specific work that we showed today, but from the whole project. Yes. Okay. Sila?
Okay, if there's no final questions or remarks, then I will just mention a couple of things. First of all, thank you to Cian and also Olivier for your presentations, and also for everybody for being so lively in the chat and sharing all these. I can see a lot of exchange happening there. So thank you very much for that. And a couple of also we'll have two like the next virtual roadshow. We had one in November of last year, and we'll have the next virtual roadshow for Agroecology-TRANSECT in probably around June or July. We'll update our events page as soon as it's finalized. And the topic of this roadshow will be biodiversity. So it'll be very interesting for this topic as well. And we'll have other roadshows coming up as well. Some that will be more country-specific series. So please do keep an eye out on the events page of our website, and that's also linked in the chat below. So I think that's probably it from our side. Thank you very much for being here, and also for all of your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next online event.